Professor Richlin is a leading historian of Roman society and culture with a particular focus on a lot of the innovative fields, areas in the field, women's history, Roman comedy and satire, and the history of sexuality. Professor Richlin's work has shaped the field of Roman history with groundbreaking scholarship on the lives of women, slaves, sexual minorities, and indigenous peoples in the provinces. She wrestles brilliantly with the challenges of excavating the voices and lived experience of people who left very little in the way of written records. And in addition to a vast body of work on Roman subaltern groups, Professor Richlin has written extensively on satire in the Roman world, with her first book entitled The Garden of Priapus, Sexuality and Aggression in Roman Humor from 1983, which engaged questions and issues of humor, gender, and power. She continued in this vein with two collections, Pornography and Representation in Greece and Rome from 1992, and Feminist Theory and the Classics from 1993. In 2005, Professor Richlin translated and published 3 plays by Plautus that elucidated Roman attitudes to the Near East and Africa. And that book was entitled Rome and the Mysterious Orient. More recently, she's turned her scholarly lens on slavery and human trafficking, as in her 2017 book, Slave Theater in the Roman Republic, Plautus and Popular Comedy, and this book won the Goodwin Award from the Society for Classical Studies. In addition to her field-defining books, Professor Richlin has written 56 articles on a vast range of topics, from everything from Foucault feminism classics to owners and slaves in and around Plautus. She's been the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Loeb Foundation. Now, before I turn the podium, the seminar table, over to Professor Richlin, I would like to thank the University of Michigan for its collaboration for making this event, this series possible, and then also to Julia Bada, Stefano Genna, and Tina Kanchemi at the American Academy for really doing all the organizing and heavy lifting for tonight. So a big thank you to them. So at the end of the lecture, we will have a question and answer period, and those who want to ask questions will move the microphone over and they can come up to the side of the room, and then we will conclude with a lovely reception with Prosecco and hors d'oeuvres. So with that, a big welcome to Professor Richlin.
Well, it is a great honor to be invited to deliver the Jerome Lectures at the American Academy. Professor Stone, amazing staff, especially Fabiana Ciccone, Tina Kanchemi, Julia Barra, Sofia Ekman, Stefano Gemma, and Gianpaolo Battaglia. Fellows, distinguished visitors, thank you for extending to me the legendary hospitality of your beautiful home. Today I'll be talking about an existential issue for the people in this room. An American Academy of what? Why are we here? Is Rome classical? Why are there classics departments? What is the origin of classical studies in the most material sense? Textbooks, classrooms, tests, curricula, degrees, research, lectures like this one. We're part of a great historical chain, a chain that nearly broke a few times, or as I like to think of it, a long, long tapestry that's rolling out across the centuries. Across the span of these lectures, I'll also keep asking another existential question. Should we be studying the Greeks and Romans now? 2 slave societies that used slave children for sex? The first question has been posed very publicly in the past few years, for example, by Danielle Padilla-Peralta, who will be here with you in 2023. Before I leave, you'll hear what I think. For now, I'm hoping to make you think. So, it is an oddity of the Academy that pedagogy is commonly taken to be the opposite of scholarship. All right, that's a joke for those of you who teach. Well, at least something separate from scholarship and too often lesser than scholarship. But in fact, there's plenty of seats up in the front if you want to come up. But in fact, the two are intimately related, as all scholars were once students who were formed by other scholars, not only in the classroom, but by the books those scholars wrote. Scholars deal with the question of what is the question, and the group decisions that scholars make about this issue determine in turn what their students think about or don't think about. And indeed, I've spent my whole career, 45 years, trying to get people to think about things they don't want to think about. So why do we read what we read? Where does the reading list come from? Where does the publisher's catalog come from? In these days of the web, it seems that we could read anything and everything, and indeed that's much truer than it ever has been. Yet the design of curricula means that in practice, classic students read very limited amounts and work long, hard hours to do so. These amounts, in turn, are pre-selected by the faculty, most of whom had to read the same list or one very similar when they were students. Many faculty members know by experience just how hard it is to change a reading list. This is true one way or another in all fields of study. But in classics, our list turns out to be very, very old. As I showed in the first lecture in Ann Arbor, the Roman sex-gender system expressed itself mainly in texts written by adult males and normally expressed sexual attraction to adolescent males as well as to women. Often, the objects of attraction were slaves, and often these texts were written down and copied over by slaves. And the attraction to adolescent males shows up in a whole range of literary and artistic forms. And note that the pederastic art seen, for example, in Roman wall painting or on Greek vases was, again, often made by slaves with slave models, as we'll discuss in Friday's seminar. This kind of male-male love is now known as pederasty from the Greek word paiderastia, boy love. The Greeks did this too, famously. My long-term research project on the letters between the young Marcus Aurelius and his teacher Cornelius Fronto led me to think about the circulation of knowledge. What happened to pederastic literature when the Roman Empire turned into Christendom? I started out expecting that the Christians shut it down, or maybe just that the Victorians shut it down. Well, the truth is yes and no. On the one hand, yes, pederastic poetry does seem to have stopped being produced in late antiquity for a while. And there's a long tradition of expurgating classical texts. On the other hand, there were always people who were against expurgation and thought the whole idea was silly. I'd like to suggest to you that the periodization students work so hard to learn is handy, but it can be misleading. We think of periods as going, bom, bom, like that. But the truth is, cultural change works more like this. So with classical antiquity on my right hand and Christendom on my left hand, and if you could imagine rivulets of water trickling from the ends of my right hand fingers, wandering through early Christendom in the West until they gush back again under Charlemagne and in the 1100s and in the Renaissance and so on. Or like a piece of knitting in which sometimes the red threads are on top and sometimes they go behind the surface, weaving in and out of view. Knowledge is hard to eradicate. You can suppress it, yes, but it comes back. To start from square one, as we know, a polytheistic world in the classical Mediterranean became a Judeo-Christian world in the 300s CE, and it stayed that way ever since, cohabiting with another form of monotheism in Islam. It was a world with a long-established system of education. Now, a Christian education should not logically incorporate pre- or non-Christian literature, and writers from late antiquity through the 19th century express a discomfort that at times motivates wholesale dismissal, even banning. However, as many have pointed out, I have a loud, resonant voice. I'm sorry. As many have pointed out, this discomfort played out differently in different places. And as laid out, better than the shower. So produced elaborate justifications for its continuation. Even these justifications can be or and mingling with that purified body, they get upon her, household slaves for the Lord Sabaoth. Now, it's hard not to be taken aback by this idea of forced marriage with classical literature, a literature that is to be shaved and pruned with its theology cleaned up and its sexual content expurgated, if that's what Jerome means. Nonetheless, he loved Roman satire. 2 millennia of preachers were to find it irresistible, and he quotes generously from it. So despite the counter-urge to get rid of it all, and that urge was strong from 500 to 700 CE, and a great deal was lost, the old literature lived on, especially because it was one of the main ingredients of the school curriculum. For a very long time in the West, education was education in Latin. And it's not just that Latin authors were studied, it's that Latin was the language spoken in school. The curriculum, especially in elementary school, revolved around reading authors, great books. And there was always a set list which fluctuated, but not all that much. So here's Ernst Curtius on the curriculum, number 2 on your handout. When Walter of Speyer was in school about 975, he read Virgil, Homer, that is the so-called Ilias Latina, Martianus Capella, Horace, Persius, Juvenal, Boethius, Statius, Terence, Lucan. This is not a casual selection, it's a normative one. It recurs as the basis of later lists. I'm sorry, my PowerPoint can be very disappointing. And here's, and here is Mark Pattison writing in his memoirs of the Latin books that he had read at home under the guidance of his father in the 1820s, long before this portrait was made of him. In the 1820s, before he went to Oxford, and this is number 3 on your handout. I had read Sallust through, about a dozen speeches of Cicero, 20 books of Livy, Virgil through, Horace through, Juvenal through, Persius through, Caesar through, Terence through. That's 800 years later. Note the recurrence of the triad Horace, Persius, Juvenal. They were read together as satirists. Well, why satire? Persius, at least, is a very difficult writer. And how many students really would have been made to read this list? Well, pretty many, it turns out. Required textbooks actually predate print. Schools were quite widespread even before the Reformation. Education was carried out in a Europe in which church and state were not separated, where future clerics might train alongside future brewers or future housewives in local schools. If you've read any Roman satire in Latin, you know that it's full of vocabulary for lots of common everyday things. And this must have been very useful in a school environment in which Latin was spoken. You can see this in medieval manuscripts in what's called vernacular glossing, for example, giving the English definition for words in the text. Tony Hunt says this glossing, quote, is associated with less attractive, more obviously utilitarian school copies. And he gives a sample Persius manuscript from around 1250 that he unkindly describes as written in an ugly hand. And a selection is in number 4 on your handout. So from Persius Satire 2, line 42, to Keta, puddings, haggis. From Satire 4, line 38, inguinibus, flonkies. And Satire 4, line 40, nates, nagis. And you can see here that for school use, the commentator was happy to explain not only words for food, but words for parts of the body below the belt. Though I don't know the tone of flonkies and nagis, the words inguina and nates are usually translated into dictionary-ese in modern dictionaries. So you'll see loins and buttocks, although these words rarely appear in prim contexts in Latin, so they meant more like groin and butt. A big reason why satire was taught in pre-modern schools was that it was considered to inculcate good morals. This has to be understood in 2 lights. First, in the later Middle Ages, authors were commonly assigned to some branch of philosophy, so satire went with ethics. Also, school was commonly understood as a place where children were sent to acquire manners. Small children began with the alphabet, followed by sententiae, that is 1 or 2 line pithy sayings, and then they read fables. And in case this seems quaint, we might reflect on what we are taught in elementary school. This old tradition is probably why our own Latin grammar books are full of sententiae. I started learning Latin in New Jersey in 1963. And even then, we began with sententiae. We each had to memorize one. And mine was risus abundat in ore stultorum, which means laughter abounds in the mouths of fools, which evidently didn't work on me. But I still remember it, which is a nice illustration of how the effects of teaching can differ from its full intent, which is a point we'll come back to. So the age at which students would have read satire and the other authors was much younger than it is now. And at times, this bothered some of those in charge of setting the curriculum. So let's look at a sample. So let's see, here is, in number 5 on your handout, is Alexander Nequam, somewhere in the early 1200s, so writing not long before the Persius manuscript we just looked at, and not too far away from it either. He was an English scholar, schoolmaster, and courtier. So he writes, "Let the student read the satirists and historians, so that he may learn even in his younger days that vices are to be shunned, and so that he may yearn to emulate the noble deeds of heroes. Let him store up the moral sayings of Juvenal in the depths of his heart, and strive above all to avoid natural sin. Let him read the satires and epistles of Horace, and the odes with the book of Epodes. Let him hear the elegies of Naso and the metamorphoses of Ovid, but let him especially acquire a familiarity with the little book on the cure for love, the Remedia Amoris. But experts have advised that amatory poetry, along with satire, should be kept out of the hands of young men. Martial, the cook, and Petronius have much in them that is useful, but much that is improper to hear." He seems torn. It's interesting that his list includes Ovidian elegy, which is a little bit R-rated, but has no boys in it. Even if he pushes the one Ovid poem that's more of an invective against women. It's interesting that he even mentions Petronius, who was discovered in England by Poggio in 1420. Oh, another picture. 300 years after Alexander Nequam, we have just a snippet from one of the most often quoted writers on Roman satire, Julius Caesar Scaliger. Provocatively, in one of his essays on satire, he issues a blanket condemnation of Juvenal. This is number 6 on your handout. "For what is more disgusting than certain verses of Juvenal? Because of their unabashed frankness, I would either order or wish that a good man should keep away from them altogether." So the printing press opened up whole methods of expurgation. Fans of expurgation in the early modern period loved to quote Scaliger as justification. Advocacy of expurgation emanated one of the most influential groups of educators in Europe from the late 1500s on, the Jesuits. And here I'd be interested to hear Professor Penry's feedback, if you're here, if you're here tonight. But I'll write to her. The Jesuit order took teaching as one of its main missions, and Jesuit teaching dominated most of Catholic Europe. Expurgation is said as a policy in the original Jesuit teaching manual, the Ratio Atque Institutio Studiorum. A century later, an eminent Jesuit scholar, Joseph de Juvisy, published a classic Jesuit teaching handbook, the Ratio Discendi et Docendi, that is, the method of learning and teaching. This book was still being endorsed for Jesuit education in the early 1900s. Juvisy's handbook included a detailed curriculum from which he prudently supplied a series of expurgated textbooks. The first Jesuit series goes back to 1616. The Jesuits basically invented the packaged curriculum, textbooks plus curriculum plus exams, as seen today, for example, in the AP Latin setup in the US, which is also expurgated. Juvisy in the Ratio put Juvenal, Persius, and Martial into one of the more advanced years of his school curriculum, as you see in number 7 on your handout. Juvenal, Persius, and Martial. Let these last poets be provided expurgated from all obscenity, and let the other plagues and poisons of schools be kept far away. So this would mean removing about 25% of Martial. One key thing here is that Juvisy's textbooks were among those most commonly pirated by other textbook writers, and for the next 100 years or so. They don't try to hide this. They boast that their text comes from the best authorities. But this very often means that what you see in what's called a school text has been repeated for a long, long time. Now, I've put just a taste of what this required reading included on your handout. I know not everybody here has actually had the benefit of being marched through this curriculum. Okay, so these passages are chosen to show how pederastic erotics were woven into the fabric of Latin literature. Number 8 on your handout comes from Horace's Satires, Book 1, Number 2, which delivers a lecture on why it's best for the reader to stay away from married women. That is, the implied reader is an adult male citizen who's interested in some hanky-panky. After explaining why prostitutes are better, the speaker comes down to something simpler. And he writes, number 8 on your handout, When your groin swells, if a slave woman or a home-born slave boy is handy, upon whom force could be applied right now, would you rather burst with a hard-on? Horace wrote this in the midst of a bloody civil war that would end the Roman Republic and bring in the first emperor, Augustus. Under his regime, adultery would be made a criminal offense. So Horace is swimming with the tide, not that the idea he expresses here is new. The other famous Roman satirist, Juvenal, wrote 150 years later under Trajan and Hadrian. His satire number 2 mostly attacks Canidae, adult males who like to be penetrated sexually. But at the end of the poem, the poet bitterly reproaches the city of Rome for having sunk so low that it degrades the barbarians, as it were. In number 9 on your handout, the poet cites the case of a boy from the wild province of Armenia, newly conquered by Trajan in 115 CE, who was effeminized at Rome, used for sex by adult males, so that when he goes back home to Artaxata, the capital of Armenia, he brings back with him the morals of boys who wear the toga praetexta, the striped toga that Roman citizen boys wore till about the age of 15 when they became men. So Juvenal writes, "For if a longer stay should dress the boys with the city, a lover will never be lacking to them." And then in the last line, "Thus they bring the morals of praetextati to Artaxata." This is a terrible reproach to Juvenal's own city, for the praetexta was supposed to be the symbol of the purity of the citizen boy. His point is, not anymore. And I'd be curious to hear your reaction to this view of cultural exchange, especially the conceit of wearing the city of Rome. Finally, number 10 on your handout, back in the reign of Augustus, is a tiny scrap from a very long poem that stayed popular from antiquity today, and indeed has been in the pages of the New York Times this week, Ovid's Metamorphoses. So, in number 10, "Let me sing of boys beloved by the gods above, and of girls in forbidden flames, thunderstruck to have earned punishment out of lust. The king of the gods above once burned with the love of Phrygian Ganymede," and so on. It's a long catalog. This comes from the Song of Orpheus in Book 10 of the Metamorphoses, and as we'll hear later, Ganymede and Orpheus became a significant pair in the 1200s CE. So moving on to St. Jerome in a Woman's Dress, the poster from this talk. And I need to say at this point that I am not a medievalist, and I want to thank Brian Keene and Tom License for getting me started with bibliography, and I crave the advice of any medievalists who are here this evening. Okay, so despite their influence on the canon, authorities like Jerome were not always treated with reverence, and I chose as the poster image for this lecture this amazing illumination of St. Jerome in a woman's dress. As you may know, if you've ever been to the Cloisters Museum in New York, the wealthy Duc de Berry commissioned the brilliant Lambourg brothers to make him a book of hours. Actually, they made 2. This image comes from the first one, the Belles-Heures. As the curators comment laconically, the story told by this picture is not part of a standard prayer book. The story comes from one of the most popular books of the Middle Ages. Written in the 1200s, it would be in print by 1494 and stay there. This was the Golden Legend of Jacobus de Voragine, full of saints' lives, that is, full of apocryphal stories. The pertinent passage from the Golden Legend is number 11 on your handout, and this passage is condensed in the caption of the image, which is visible on the screen. I don't know if you can read it. So I put the end bit on the handout because it's mistranslated on the Met's website. So just FYI. But back to number 11. All right, so however, when Pope Liberius died, that is 366 CE, Jerome was acclaimed by all as worthy of the highest priesthood. He could have been Pope Jerome. But while he was railing about the lustfulness of certain clerics and monks, they, taking much umbrage, set up a trap for him, and by means of a woman's dress, he was disgracefully mocked by them. For when Jerome was getting up for matins in his usual way, he found a woman's dress which his rivals had placed next to his bed, and believing it to be his, he put it on and went to church. His rivals actually did this so that people would think he had a woman in his bedroom. When he saw this, he gave way to their craziness and then took off for the Holy Land. The story is told in the Belles Arts in the form of a comic strip running from right to left. So in the first panel on the right, we see the monk sneaking into Jerome's bedroom with a blue dress as the future saint snoozes on, undiscommoded by his halo. Then in the second panel on the left, we see the bleary-eyed Jerome walking into the church for matins, holding his lantern to show it was dark and he couldn't see, while two monks share a bitchy comment in the side stalls. Oh, the devil in a blue dress. The Metropolitan Museum thinks this piece is there in the Book of Hours for the Lamberg brothers to show off. But I think it's there to give the Duke a laugh. Not only is Jerome, the famous satirist, himself here satirized, but the scene plays off what monks look like to the worldly and lordly. Popular jokes about monastic vices, just what Jerome was complaining about himself, are too many to count from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance. And then look at the distance between item 1 on the handout, the captive slave woman, and Jerome as a woman. Indeed, he was notorious for his connections with wealthy women, possibly why he had to leave Rome for the Holy Land, so it's pointing to his hypocrisy here. Simultaneously, he is feminized by this joke. The distance between the captive slave woman and Jerome in a dress pervades the history of sexuality in the West, from the early Middle Ages and the penitentials to the early 20th century. And this is a case of what I think of as Lloyd's Law, after the historian of science Geoffrey Lloyd and his book Demystifying Mentalities. That is, conflicting systems coexist. Certainly, though, there are things in the Middle Ages that we have not seen before, like bestiality and the penitentials. Now, much has been written about these handbooks. They were for the use of priests in order to guide them in handing out penalties. And much has been said about the whole concept of sin and repentance in connection with sex under Christendom. So that aside, I just want to glance at an early penitential from Anglo-Saxon England, and this is number 13 on your handout. The first rule comes from a penitential in Latin. One who fornicates often with a male or with a beast, he judged should do penance for 10 years. All right, and then we have the translation into Old English. And I'll read the text first because I love to read Old English aloud. I don't often get to do it. Saith mit badlinga hammer, author mit othram wapned men, author mit newtna, faste tea and winter. So, which means if one has sex with a, meaning is disputed, or with other armsmen, or with beasts, he should fast for 10 winters. Now, there's much to interest us here. The equivalent penalties for male-male sex and male-beast sex, the fraught question of what a badling is, and this is disputed, but it probably just means mollus, that is an effeminate male. The common use of wapned mon to mean adult male, so a guy who's packing, that's what a real man is. The translator has felt it necessary to differentiate among types of male object, which wasn't in the Latin original. We just don't find this concern with bestiality in antiquity. There's a joke about it in the fables of Phaedrus, actually in connection with slave shepherds. It wasn't something people worried about. I think this concern in the year 700 indicates just how rural the old empire had become. Now, you may know John Boswell's theory that it was the collapse of cities that changed the sex-gender system, not so much Christianity. So, just a thought. As far as we can dimly see traces of erotic feelings in the years from 700 to 1000 in the West, we're looking in the letters and poems of clergy like Alcuin and Aelred, who expressed a deep love for some fellow clergy. How physical it was is hotly debated. The texts themselves are much like the letters of Paulinus of Nola, certainly spiritual, whatever else they were. But around the year 1000, things start to change again. And through the 1100s, we find a literary boom that included poems to boys once again. And Diane Elliott argues that this revival was a result of the crackdown on married clergy after 1139. This is also the time when the Fablio gets started, but I'm sticking with Latin here. There's a kind of canon of these pederastic writers, all of whom were associated with monasteries and cathedral schools. I've just put a few on your handout to represent some of the common features of this poetry, and please don't ask me to explain the meters. Number 14 on your handout by Marbot de Rennes comes with a title, A Satire on the Lover of a Boy under an Assumed Character. Now this gives Marbot plausible deniability. The same tactic was used by another of these poets, Baudry of Bourgogne, who took Ovid as his model, which is an even slipperier one, since Ovid states that his loves are fictional. Marbot doubles down on his deniability by also taking a model, in this case, Horace. So Horace wrote an ode about a certain boy who easily could be a pretty girl. His hair flowed in waves down his ivory neck, blonder than gold, the kind I've always loved. And then it goes on, and then at the end he says, these words, dearest of my commandments, sent to you alone, don't show to many. The boy who looks like a girl is a stock character in pederastic poetry through at least the time of Ausonius in the 300 CE. As for the deployment of Horace here, this kind of thing was a tactic in ancient writing that I've called retrosexual. So the argument is, well, they did it, they wrote it like that, so I can write it. But we shouldn't forget that along with Horace's erotic odes, in which boy's beauty is praised, Horace's widely read satires include that brutal recommendation to his readers to grab a slave boy when they're feeling lustful. Thus, noteworthy here is the closing with the command, don't tell. Now, this is not an issue with a slave boy. To us, this command instantly suggests a consciousness of sexual abuse, a need to hide. However, it closes a poem that was obviously meant to circulate. But the boy is not named, even falsely, as he would have been in antiquity, and the stakes are much higher for both, even than they would have been for Catullus, because Marbot was master of a cathedral school. Number 15 on your handout is an often quoted jingle by the satirist Walter of Chatillon, and here's a true-to-life portrait of Walter. The sons of nobles, while they're young, are sent to France to become educated, and corruptors control them by persuading or by paying. This is actually funnier in Latin. Then they bring back the morals of praetextati to Artoxida. So you can see why these lines get a lot of mileage with the conflation of education, with sexual predation, all in association with the wicked ways of Paris, because Francia in this period is the Ile-de-France. Diane Elliott points out that the boys who went to the universities in this period were often as young as 14, and that students were proverbially poor and hungry, nobles or not. But to us, as we're thinking about the history of the curriculum, the last line causes a big shock because it's the last line of Juvenal's second satire, as we've seen. And everybody had to read satire in school. So this is a big example of the kind of literary spoliation that was practiced in late antiquity. But it isn't really spoliation, it's not just slapped in, since in order to get the full meaning, to crack the code, to get the joke, the reader has to know the original poem. So Walter knocks the University of Paris, which was his own alma mater. But on the other hand, everybody else is a barbarian. So he kind of has it both ways here. John Boswell referred to this boom in literary pederasty as the triumph of Ganymede. And indeed, Ganymede frequently figures among this group of poets. So in number 16 on your handout by Hilary the Englishman, believe me, if Jove brought back the dawn ages, Ganymede now would not be his little homeboard slave, but you, snatched up to the heavens, would be giving welcome cups to Jove by day, more welcome kisses to Jove by night. Now this poem could have been written at any time from Martial on, except for the meter. It's entirely conventional. Yet Ganymede's reign would turn out to be limited. But I want to pause in this march through the Middle Ages for a bibliographical note. In beginning to learn about this period, I often saw cited the book by Thomas Staling you see on the bibliography, and I ordered a used copy from Abe Books, and here you see it on my messy desk. This turns out to be a work of what I think of as shadow scholarship, a slim text put together outside the university press system by a devoted amateur. The copy that arrived at my house had inside it a file card, as you see, with the owner's notes. His name is on a bookplate inside the back cover. He turned out to be an early gay rights activist from deep in southern Texas. The file card shows that he saw a notice of this book's publication in The Advocate, an LGBT magazine that got started in 1967, when it was definitely edgy. The handwritten notes continue on the back and detail the owner's efforts to get the book, first from the bookstore Lambda Rising in DC, possibly the closest gay bookstore, and then from the publisher. John Boswell's famous 1980 book included translations of these poems in a 50-page appendix, but included the Latin for very few of them. Staling evidently wanted to fill that gap and put the Latin and English on facing pages, like a Loeb text, which he knew would never exist. His book did earn a review in the leading medievalist journal Speculum by the young Jan Ziolkowski, a devastating review, pointing out inaccuracies in the text and errors in the translation. And I cannot help but feel that our field could still do a service by making available a sound edition of this book, not just by tearing it down. Yeah. As we'll see in the history of sexuality in the 19th and 20th centuries, ordinary people put together knowledge the best they could before the web. So the triumph of Ganymede did not last. The 1200s saw a backlash for which this image will have to stand. As Robert Mills details at length in Seeing Sodomy in the Middle Ages, interpreters in the 1200s remade the meaning of Ovid in Ovid Moralisé. Mills focuses on the poet Orpheus and the Metamorphoses and his turn to boys after the death of Eurydice. Ganymede is among the boys that Orpheus sings of, as we saw. Orpheus, of course, comes to a bad end. And Mills has some hard-to-get images of Ganymede and Orpheus from Ovid Moralisé. Similarly, this image from the Bible Moralisé shows what same-sex lovers can expect after death. The presence here of a pair of women is unusual, and they are alongside a pair of males, of whom one is a monk, while his partner is maybe a Jew, judging from his headgear. And here I defer to Professor Gallant, if you're here, on the way such illuminations carried meaning. So back to Ganymede and his maybe non-triumph. Diane Elliott begins her important study, The Corrupter of Boys, with a description of how she came to write the book. In 2002, the news story broke about how the Diocese of Boston had been covering up the rape of children by priests. The policy was keep silent and move the priest. Elliott describes this as an uncanny moment for her, for, she writes, this is a quote, "I remembered that a similar solution had been anticipated by the 13th century scholastic Henry of Gaunt, who raised the question of what a superior should do in the event that he learns through confession that one of his subordinates is a threat to his parishioners. I began to wonder if this degree of ecclesiastical subterfuge in concealing clerical vice had been in place long before the multiple scandals that rocked the Boston Church and the world." And I would add here that Archbishop Bernard Law, who was responsible for the cover-up in Boston, was simply moved by the Vatican to become the cardinal priest of Santa Susanna here in Rome, which was the American parish in Rome, until Law's death in 2017, 5 years ago. So Elliott is looking for sexual abuse and not a triumph. Elliott casts a wide net in building her case. Sometimes we can catch a faint echo of something rarely seen, popular songs that objectify boys. So Manasses I, Archbishop of Reims, claimed that the Bishop of Langres liked to go to cities where he, quote, listened to male singers and their songs about boyish lovers. When he returned home, he brought these filthy songs with him and proceeded to sing them to his friends. And Manasses even quotes a line from one of these songs, "Come beautiful and tender one, with flesh as soft as a girl's." Popular songs on such a theme after 1200 are unknown to me until just a few years ago. Now LGBT teens can put Conan Gray on their Spotify list, and he even has a hit titled Greek God. The main thing here is how songs circulate. So light, so airy, such useful code, so deniable, traveling as fast and easily as jokes do. Most of Eliot's sources, of course, are written and derived from monasteries and cathedrals, which all had boy choirs and choir schools, which are attested going back to late antiquity. Surprisingly, one of the big issues of polyphony, which comes in around 1200, the mixing of male voices, was considered lascivious. In other respects, the issues raised by abbey schools and their dormitories will remain familiar through the 20th century. We'll hear more about that in the next lecture. Abbeys took in what were called oblates, that is, small boys offered by their families to be raised up to become monks, and these little boys were entirely vulnerable. It is shocking to read that when they were used for sex by older boys, it is the younger boys who were punished more severely. They were not only used, but blamed for it. So Eliot cites this early rule by Hildemar of Chivate, which is number 17 on your handout. My translation. If a brother 15 years of age or more grabs a little one and commits fornication with that little boy, let the little boy be flogged with the rod and chastised for this. And David Clark cites a similar rule from the 1100s with a higher penance if the little boy consents. Well, how can this be? Well, children were not thought to be innocent, but full of original sin. Young boys, like Eve, were inherently tempting. So the slave boys who fill the pages of Martial fade from view in the medieval West, although I'm sure they were still there. In their place are the oblates, the choir boys, the children of the free poor. Conditions would have varied from place to place, as always. We know about monasteries because that's where we have a lot of texts from. So then at the end, Eliot devotes a whole chapter to Italy, which she says was a byword for sodomy all over Europe, so that the city of Florence actually became a verb, Florencize, in the late Middle Ages. All right, so finally, let me see if I can do the Italian Renaissance in 3 minutes. For indeed, it was Italians who rediscovered Catullus and other erotic writers and began to churn out editions and commentaries just in time for the printing press to circulate them to a degree never before seen. One of my big questions in this project has always been, I understand why Catullus barely made it through the Middle Ages, or I thought I did, but why did Martial survive in so many manuscripts who's much more obscene? So I turned to the great Julia Geiser for an answer, and this is what she thinks. This is what she wrote me. It had nothing to do with content. Catullus, she thinks, was too old-fashioned and learned. Martial was easier and more fun and witty, too. Nor should it be surprising that what people say and what they do can be very different. That is, some monks inflicted punishment, some wrote pederastic poetry, lots of them copied over Martial. Then in Italy in the Renaissance, she says attitudes varied from city to city and decade to decade. Antonio Beccadelli was attacked for his notorious book of epigrams, The Hermaphrodite, but she says his poems were widely read and enjoyed and imitated all over Italy. The commentaries on Catullus, Tibullus, and so on were often explicit, and they were used by students. But the assumption was that these students were going to be highly educated themselves. The ignorant were not at risk of corruption. And this is one point in what she wrote me that I'm not sure I fully buy. This is, after all, what about the students? And the servants who were present in the room, as always. On your handout are just a couple of excerpts from the front and back matter of a couple of later Renaissance commentaries on the Carmen of Praia Pia. one of the dirtiest texts in Latin, full of threats of rape against boys and men and women. In general, the commentators are mainly concerned to prove the authorship of the collection. The big question, was it really Virgil? Many thought so, because after all, everyone knew that Virgil loved slave boys. But many bring up a passage where it's implied that at least one poem in the collection was by Ovid, but few agree, because after all, Ovid says in the Ars Amatoria that he doesn't like sex with boys because they get no pleasure from it. In the Carmen of Priapia, the speaker is the god Priapus, who's the one who threatens rape. And you'll see him in Pompeii. Priapus was a minor god with a giant phallus, and statuettes and paintings of him are all over the Roman landscape. The commentators float their own ingenious theories about the poems, and my favorite one is the idea that Priapus is an example of euhemerism, that he was actually originally a man with an unusual body. Repeatedly, the commentators use the word elegant to justify their high opinion of the poems, by which they mean metrically perfect and aesthetically pleasing. So this is a big question that I'm posing in this series. Can art justify content? They direct their students and young men generally to pay attention, these commentators. Passing over earlier commentaries, I moved to Joseph Scaliger. This is the son of Julius Caesar Scaliger. In number 18 on your handout, Scaliger, a convert to Calvinism, expresses an ambivalence about the Priapia that's full of self-justification. He writes, "Rather that age is to be execrated in which it was permitted to men to write disgusting things, since they were not prohibited from also doing disgusting things." This is a bit of cultural relativism. But then he argues against himself. Can I suppress what has now been published in so many editions? Well, he's writing an edition. The cat is out of the bag. Information wants to be free. And finally, in number 20, the piratical Caspar Scioppius, surely tongue-in-cheek, wonders whether it's right for the young to see this book. And then he cites doctors, lawyers, and theologians as particularly benefited by what the book teaches. Number 20 on the handout gives a brief example of the useful lessons held within. It is a lot of rape jokes. The most notorious adopter of this kind of language was, as you've heard, Antonio Beccadelli, known as Il Panormita because he came from Palermo. Here's what was said about Beccadelli's book in 1906. "Repulsive though the subject be, we must speak of his Hermaphroditus, or a collection of epigrams, because the spirit of the false Renaissance is here manifested in all its hideousness. The most horrible crimes of heathen antiquity, crimes whose very name a Christian cannot utter without reluctance, were here openly glorified. Cosmo de' Medici accepted the dedication of this loathsome book, which is proved by the countless copies in Italian libraries to have had but too wide a circulation." So it was a nameless crime, and it's too bad it circulated so widely. So we're going to see these ideas again in the next lectures. But the stakes began to change as the state stepped in. Julia Geiser points out that the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, she says, took a very hard line on pederasty and homosexuality. She instances the humanist Marc-Antoine de Muret in 1554, charged with being a Huguenot and a sodomite. He fled for his life from Toulouse, where they burned him in effigy. He found refuge in Rome with Cardinal d'Este. Back in 1468, however, members of the Roman Academy, was sort of an early AA, American Academy in Rome, a sort of humanist hellfire club, were imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo on similar charges. And state censorship of obscene books, as Joan Dejean argues, really got started in Paris in 1623, to be followed by state capital punishment for sodomy. So the perception of obscenity as a thing in written texts, especially in the vernacular, goes along with this state crackdown on sexual behavior. So these issues are all around us today. So here is a censored image. This flyer attacking the young adult graphic novel Genderqueer was passed out in front of an elementary school in Santa Barbara this past September. And let me point out that the makers of the flyer pasted in the offensive page from Genderqueer with the art that they objected to. It was the online newspaper that blacked out the explicit graphics, which is a repeated ironic phenomenon in current efforts to ban books. Genderqueer was the most banned book of 2021 in the US. And it's of concern to us, at least the classicists here, that another page censor groups object to is a redrawing of a famous Greek vase painting by the Brygos painter, which is well known from Kenneth Dover's book, Greek Homosexuality. In the next lecture, we'll hear about a teacher in Victorian England who was fired and his unexpected relationship with classical texts. So thank you for listening. I'm glad to take questions.
Thank you, Amy, for a wonderful and thought-provoking lecture. And if people want to ask questions, they could come up to the front. I'll move the microphone over. Light. I think it's on. Go ahead. Who would like, do we have questions?
Oh, Sarah. Hi.
I have a question. So most of the texts you showed us from like up until the Renaissance seem to be about like whether we can teach this material. And then you also alluded to, I forget the name of the scholar, but thinking about what are we going to do with someone who's been found with boys or working with them. But I'm wondering, so in antiquity, there's always kind of the question of, do we have the voice of some of these people who have been abused, right? And with scholars recently, like I'm thinking of in my field, Ruth Bielefeld and Ulrika Roth have looked at the Trimalchio passage where he talks about sort of this was my history. I was abused, and sort of you see very clearly in the dinner party of Trimalchio that now he's an abuser himself, right? Mm-hmm. Do you, in that kind of, I don't know if we have more examples of that in antiquity, but also in these Middle Ages, do you have anyone kind of speaking not just to whether we teach this, but kind of reflecting on their engagement with it, or either they were abused, or is it just in the kind of poems where they reference Horace and then they write a poem or something?
So somebody who testifies both to experience in youth and then grows up to, look like Scaliger.
Right, and I only know of one example in antiquity, so I don't know if...
What's that?
Or just the Trimalchio one is the only one.
Yeah, well, the Trimalchio one, though, is, I wish that that's what it was, but, this is a character in a novel, so it's a perfect example. When he tells his autobiography and he says, well, when I was, a slave boy, I did what the master wanted, he says, and I did it for 14 years. And he says, it's like, no, it's nothing, what the master says is, it's just no harm, no foul. Right. But, and then he is all messing around with the boys at the dinner. So is it, is this, the voice that I've been dealing with is the young Marcus Aurelius, who has tons to say. But when he grew up, and we do have, he's, I think, the one figure I know from antiquity who we both have a lot of how he felt when he was 18. And then in the Meditations, there's a very brief line about his early sexual experience where he says he didn't have anything to do with it. He had nothing to do with boys himself. And that, and this is something that he got from his father, by whom he means Antoninus Pius. He doesn't mean Hadrian. and he was 16 when he was living in the house of Hadrian. So anyway, so he, as an older man, he just totally steps back from this. You would hardly know that these two texts were written by the same person. But that's one example. And
do you see anything like that in the medieval era, or has it's just about
no,
and we're wondering whether to teach it or not?
Yeah, especially there's nothing like Trimalchio, well, I did it when I was a boy, and now it's my turn, or anything like that. No, nothing. The people that Diane Elliott quotes from, but she has one of the things that she does, her special area of expertise is canon law. So she has some court testimonies, and and their people do talk about their experience, or at least they testify to their experience. But do you have a through line with any of these people? Not that I noticed in the whole book. Okay. There's people that other people comment about who were like notoriously a toy boy for a senior bishop, and then were promoted and so on, and then they're written about by other people as they went on in life to become cardinals, but it's not at all the same thing. So the voice, the voice of the, I guess in the first lecture I talked about muted groups and out groups, the voices that you don't hear from. Right. And I think that these boys who are in these poems are maybe one of the most muted groups there is from antiquity. Yeah,
and I guess maybe I read the Trimalchio one sympathetically. I think it's Ruth Bielefeld who talks about how when he's recounting his time as a boy, he's comparing himself to the basically, I can't remember if it's a candelabra or probably an image of a boy
he's
holding
measuring
it.
Himself against the
and when will I grow my beard, and when will I get out of this, basically.
Yeah, I used to grease my lips. One of my students conjectured that the grease that he was taking out of the lamp was actually black, so that it looked like it actually looked like he had a beard. Not that the lamp grease was going to make him grow a beard, but that, that's not really what the Latin says, but it's an interesting idea.
Thank you.
All right, yeah. Where you do get this kind of thing, with the confessional thing, is in some tell-all memoirs from the Victorian period, but not really at all what I would have wanted from antiquity. A lot of showboating mostly.
Right. Pretty.
Thank you for that lecture. I'm looking forward to what follows. This is not entirely a fair question, but you did start off with saying, why do we have classics departments? Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, why do we have classics departments which are basically Western classics? And why don't we have a classics department which includes other classics from the world? And what do you think, how do you think that you might find in the story that you tell, similarities, just even from maybe little anecdotal evidence or something, from other traditions as well? I can think of, books I've read and memoirs and stuff like that from other. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that.
Sure, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I started thinking back in the 1980s that classics departments should go back to the model that they had in the 19th century before the great divorce between classics and biblical studies, when all classical scholars knew Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and some other non-Indo-European languages. Because that was what the ancient Mediterranean was like. It was a place where there were Semitic languages as well as, side by side, totally integrated with the Greek and Latin speakers and many other languages. But this doesn't really speak to the point that you're making. And I think that, that there are some world language departments that do try to do that. Of course, there's any amount of stuff from Indian literature, Persian literature, Korean literature, what else do I know? Where you would certainly find parallels to this. One of the interesting, I did some work on the Jesuits teaching Latin and Greek to the First Nations and Native Americans, And they certainly were teaching them to read Roman satire. But I haven't looked at any of the South American stuff, you know, and you know, there's someone here doing a project on Peru. So I know very little about, you know, like matchups in Inca culture. But I think it would be a great conference for one thing. Actually, I went to a very good conference on obscenity in the novel that was China, Japan, and European. And that was very productive and eye-opening. So I don't know, you know, I mean, academic departments, well, you know as well as I do, that, you know, try and get a dean to, you know, one of the points of this lecture is how very entrenched these boundaries are.
Yeah.
So, but maybe now is the time to change it, I don't know.
Thank you.
But anyway, thank you.
Other questions? Evan, you shaking your head? No? Yes, come on up.
Thanks for that. That was fascinating. You brought it up at one point, the kind of situation in the medieval period, and I know it's not like your field or my field, so maybe Lamia or someone else who's working on this can fill us in during the reception. But I was wondering, like, are you thinking about kind of with this how slavery changes over time, right? And what implications that might have for these boys, but also, you know, people in general, and how they become sexual objects and so forth, right? From the period that we know, right, in, you know, the classical Roman period down into, you know, in late antiquity, we have, maybe people would argue, an intensification of slavery in some ways. And then I'm not sure about Middle Ages, but it definitely continued, right?
It does continue.
And you have like other forms of kind of subjugation and control. And these, you know, you're talking about the free poor, but also the situation of the church and how that creates another, you know, deprivation of agency and so forth. So
Yeah, so I don't know if I put this, Catherine, no, I didn't put it on the, all right. So in terms of these oblates, you know, these children, so this kind of thing starts out actually with the Desert Fathers, with the very beginning of monasteries. And there's a very good new book by Caroline Schroeder, I think her last name is, that just came out, which has a whole chapter about this. It's just really excellent about skete. And then also the Diane Elliott's book is very, very rich in examples, you know, kind of circumstantial stuff about apprentices and other dependent young men or young male persons who were, you know, got embrangled with the education system, basically. This leaves out so much, you know, it leaves out the whole secular world. You know, I realized when I said, oh, well, you know, I skipped the Middle Ages, so let me see if I can do a lecture on the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I'm like, well, actually, I'm talking about, well, about 1,000 years. So it's and so right now I'm just going by what people have mostly talked about, what Boswell talked about. But it was a big deal for me about 10 years ago when I read Michael McKinnon's book on the origin of the European economy, and he has this big central chapter on slavery and the continuation of slavery right through the Middle Ages. And then I realized what I should have read a long time ago was Ruth Karas's early work on slavery in Western Europe. Again, this is very Western. But I needed McKinnon because I was reviewing a book about Byzantium that just totally left out slaves when they were talking about issues of the abuse of women or whatever. But, you know, did they talk about slaves? No. And prostitution? No. Anyway, McKinnon is, you know, is clear with this evidence. So I think that they're there, and then Ruth Karas has a lot of evidence. So I think that being sexually abused kind of goes along with being a slave. I think it's part of the general definition. Anyway, I'll have to see what the evidence will show. But let's see, so now I lost track of the question here. It's just bibliography, I guess.
no, it was more just like, do you see like kind of diachronic change? Because I know that you've kind of argued in one of the readings for the seminar that,
Yeah.
you know, really slavery is one of the main ways in which people become sexual objects in the Roman world. But
Yes.
I guess we kind of, you know, we don't think about the Greek period so much, like about slavery and and sex in that situation as much. We always think of it in terms of the freeborn, like, you know, Erastes or Romanos situation and so forth. But that was also another current, probably,
Yeah.
right? And
So
then-
Catherine McKinnon in Does Sexuality Have a History, you know, talks about the gendering of positions, and she says the position on the bottom is always feminine or feminized, right? So it is, I am convinced now, or I mean, I've come to the conclusion that the Greek and Roman sex gender systems were basically based on the fact that they're slave societies. Like, this is how these roles evolved. And as Sandra Joshel and Bridget Murnahan say, the free woman's honor was constructed out of the slave woman's dishonor. And then Kyle Harper demonstrates that at great length. At the same time, there's the free boy versus the slave boy. There's, you know, Trimalchio versus whatever you think Encolpius is. Or anyway, the reader, or possible, I don't know. What was the readership of the Satyricon? But, so what, you know, what changes if the system still goes on, and there clearly still is pederasty? One of the questions I wanted to ask was also, you know, does what you read determine who you love, or does who you love determine what you read? Is it, you know, just all wrapped up together? Is it true that as these monks read Martial, they felt enabled? You know, did they learn from Catullus? Was this grooming? You know, was the classical curriculum like a form of grooming? And this brings us back to arguments that, you know, that like kind of predate Foucault about hardwiring and, you know, versus social constructionism. I mean, this is, in terms of the historical watershed that I'm dealing with here, this is a major historical watershed, the disappearance of the Greek and Roman sex gender system. So I'm saying that it went underground, that it didn't go away, but boy did it go underground, you know, and now it's firmly underground. So anyway, that's a very large answer to a big question.
I think on that note, we will thank Professor Richlin again for a wonderful conversation.